Something weird happened one summer day in 1961 at the port of my small hometown in Denmark, and I was there to witness it. 7-year-old Michael thought the waterfront was one of the most thrilling and forbidden locations he'd ever seen in his life. My first experience of the presence of a spiritual realm, which is essentially distinct from what words can represent, occurred during this period of my life. I was down by the port with my best friend Peter, and we were having a good time on prohibited territory. Peter had transformed the harbor pier into what appeared to be the most natural and fun playground on the planet, thanks to his imaginative thinking. A raft of logs was anchored to the pier between two fishing boats, which made for an interesting sight. 2 ropes were fastened to the stonework at the harbor entrance. Peter jumped from the wall and onto the raft below him in a single bound. I chased after him and caught up with him. As a result, the raft began to move out into the harbor until it reached the end of the rope, at which point it began to drift back towards the dock. When the raft got close to the dock, we'd jump out and onto land. We repeated this numerous times, culminating in a race to determine who would dare to jump off the raft while it was the furthest away from the dock. It was my turn to take the plunge the previous time. It was a mistake to jump so short, and I came down only half a meter from the raft. It was as though everything was taking place in slow motion. I sank into the water without making a sound, and my eyes opened as soon as I did. Slowly, vertically sinking into the ground, I became aware of the silence surrounding me. I couldn't swim for the life of me. However, for some reason, I felt fully secure and at ease in my surroundings. Despite the fact that I was on the verge of drowning, this sensation persisted. After pushing off the seabed in an attempt to reach the surface, I ended up hitting my head against the raft's bottom. I was injured. Suddenly, everything turned black, and time appeared to have stopped. It didn't feel like a dream at all. On the contrary, I viewed it as a real and genuine experience. I was conscious of the fact that I was in the harbor water and beneath the raft. I didn't take a breath, but I also didn't hold my breath either. I was aware that I might be on the verge of passing away, but I was unconcerned about it. The condition of being I was in was the safest I'd ever felt in my entire life. Behind me and to my right, a dazzling angel-like figure manifested himself. It wasn't until much later that I realized I'd been able to see this being, despite the fact that he was outside of my field of view during this particular event. Cookie was the nickname given to me by the angel, who spoke to me in the most pleasant male voice I'd ever heard. In his company, I felt the most peace I'd ever experienced. I had an intuitive sense that he was my light angel, despite the fact that I'd never heard of such a thing prior to meeting him. Suddenly, a massive movie reel emerged in front of me, and the light angel took me through my entire life from my birth until the moment I jumped into the water in great detail. Strangely enough, I was able to see my entire life in a matter of minutes. Several times during the course of the film, the movie came to a halt. In each case, it was about circumstances in which I had done something that had caused me to feel terrible because I was aware that what I had done had been inappropriate. I had lied numerous times and had also stolen on a few occasions. It was explained to me what this meant to other people and why I had made a mistake. At the end of the session, the light angel stated to me that my life had a deeper meaning and that there were certain things I needed to go through in order to follow the plan that had been placed in my path throughout my life. During his explanation, I began to recognize him, though I couldn't put my finger on where I had met him or who he had been before. When the movie reached to the point where I was about to leap into the water, The show came to an abrupt halt. I inquired as to whether I could view any more because the film roll had a significant amount of tape remaining on the reel. "Now you'll have to go back into the world, where you'll be mending sick people and doing things related to music," he remarked, smiling in the most comfortable way he could. "In order to be successful in your life, you must first attain these two goals." It was impossible for me to convince him to leave because this location was so much more caring and magnificent than the world in which I was used to living. He said, "No," in the most compassionate way possible. I opened my eyes and saw everything go black in front of my eyes. And then everything came back to life. On the raft, I noticed the eyes of a man who was sitting and bending over me. I struggled to take a breath and was pushed to one side to break up some sea foam by the crew. Mucus and seawater had been plastered all over my face and hair. Despite the fact that I was drowning, I felt fantastic. I was wondering where my pal Peter had disappeared to. The man informed me that a young boy had reached beneath the raft and grabbed my hair, after which he had attempted to pull me out of the water with his hands. It was the man who had assisted him in pulling me all the way up onto the raft. He had been convinced that I was dead for quite some time because I'd been still for so long. But here I was, smiling at him, and he couldn't make any sense of what I was saying. Because the angel had demonstrated to me that death does not exist, I was in unbelievable feeling of bliss and joy. The gravity of the issue became clear to me all of a sudden. After all, I was terrified that if my parents found out, I would be in terrible trouble and would be banned to play with my friend Peter any longer. I leapt to my feet and dashed off the raft as quickly as I could. I took off running down the trail. Peter arrived with tarred fishing nets in tow as he walked silently up to me. He confessed to me that he had fled and was hiding because he was scared that I might be dead and they would kill him. He didn't want to get up in problems with the law. Peter had been watching the man who was administering artificial respiration to me and was relieved and delighted when he noticed that I had regained consciousness. We returned home, but we stopped along the way to let me hang all of my things to dry on a nearby fence. When Peter hauled me out of the water by my hair, he continued to brag about his heroism to his friends. He didn't notice me jumping because he had his back turned. All of a sudden, I had just vanished, he explained. Peter was under the impression that I was hiding or had gone somewhere else. He had been looking for me for quite some time. He had plunged down on the raft and then dipped his head into the water to get his bearings. He discovered that I had been laying under the raft when he arrived. My mind was completely focused on my encounter with the angel at the time, almost as if I were in a trance, and I had no idea what was going on around me. I tried to explain to Peter what had happened to me, but he didn't seem to believe a word I had to say about it. The notion that I could have died didn't bother me, since I had realized that death was no longer something I needed to be terrified of after all these years. Fortunately, the sky was clear and the sun was beaming. My clothing were almost completely dry after only an hour. What should I tell my folks when I get back to my house? What had happened to me? Who had I been spending time with? We parted ways just before we reached home, and we both agreed that the details of today's experience should be kept between the two of us. When I returned home, the world was in a complete disarray. My parents were completely out of their minds since I had failed to arrive at the house for supper at the scheduled time. This was a pretty unusual occurrence. Even though they had called around to my friend's parents' residence, they were unable to locate me. Eventually, they contacted the authorities, who were now on their way to investigate the situation further. They acted quickly and phoned the police again, allowing the emergency to be canceled. I was being kissed and scolded at the same time, and the questions were pouring in from all directions. What had happened to me? Who had I been spending time with? What made me think I'd be content with simply staying away? The thought occurred to me that I had never done that before, and how could my clothes be so damp? And where was my cowboy belt with the gun that had been given to me as the birthday gift? It was only after that I realized I had misplaced my cowboy belt. It had to have been at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. The most horrifying falsehood I could concoct was in direct opposition to what the angel had warned me to do. I explained to my parents that I had been playing on the beach by myself, and that I had most likely misplaced my cowboy belt somewhere in the sand. I would not have dared to return home without my cowboy belt, so I trotted up and down the street looking for it. My mother became really enraged when she saw that I had thrown away my cowboy belt. That evening, my friend and I went the entire length of the beach in search of the belt. Of course, we were unable to locate it. It's been a long time since I've felt this much shame about lying. This is due to the fact that the words of the angel reverberated throughout my mind. It was almost as if he was still present with me. I had the distinct impression that he was still keeping an eye on everything that was going on. The incident has had a profound impact on my life. I immediately called Peter to tell him what had happened. Nonetheless, it would be some years before I was able to confide in anybody else about what had happened.